Thank you, Monique. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks to the speaker for having for having accepted this invitation, and thanks to the Humboldt Center for providing administrative and technical support. This event is part of Black History Month celebration at the EUI, and it's the first time the EUI is celebrating Black History Month. I mean, on an institutional level, we already did a couple of events last year, but this is the first year that Black History Month is celebrated to this scale. This is an initiative from PhD researcher from the history department. And the aim of this special Black History Month at the EUI is to make more visible the long-lasting history of Black people in Europe, but also to address questions such as European colonial legacies and also the persistence of racism in Europe. So it goes beyond history, even though it's organized by historians. I mean, this event today, which is very much interdisciplinary, shows that the discussion has to go beyond a question of history. And it's also the occasion to talk about experiences of Black people in Italy, in Europe more broadly, but also in the academia. And to this last point, I'd like to shortly promote the podcast that has been done by EUI Library, but because they did a couple of interviews of Black members of the EUI community, and the podcasts are available online. And there's also an interview with Justin, the director of Black History Month Florence, because Black History Month at the EUI is also the result of a collaboration with Black History Month Florence. Black History Month Florence has been created in 2016, and it's a cross-institutional network for Black cultural production. And the aim of this network is to celebrate the diversity of Afro-descendant cultures in the context of Italy. So I wanted to say that it is a shame that this event is held online, because I think when we had this idea with Fatoun to organize this roundtable, we really wanted to create a space to meet and to discuss the topic of Blackness in Europe. We wanted to welcome scholars doing Black European studies, if we can call it like this, from different perspectives, from different fields, from different national contexts. And on a symbolic level, we wish that we could have brought this debate physically in Florence, physically in Italy, and also within the wall of the EUI, which is, as many of you know, the home institution of hundreds of PhD students and also postdocs from all around Europe. But I mean, no regret, I'm really excited about the event today. And hopefully like the global pandemic situation will get better, and we will be able soon to have this kind of event in person. And I mean, I don't want I'm not living on regret, and I'm really happy that this is happening. And since this is the last event of Black History Month at the EUI, I wanted to say something about it, because the event and the activities that we organized in this context had different purposes. First, it was obviously the opportunity to talk about the past and the present of Black people in Europe. But what's more important, at least for me, is that it is a way to continue the struggle for racial justice. And it is also a way to think about the role of university, the role university should play actually in this struggle, and also place, not only university as a place of knowledge production, but also as a place that's, as a specific environment that can be a driver for social change. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And now I leave the floor to Lucy.
Thanks very much, Daphne. It's for me to give the institutional welcome and to say what a great pleasure it is to host this event at the EUI. And also to say that sort of beyond the institutional level, it's personally a huge pleasure for me and a very exciting moment for me to bring Black History Month into the EUI. I echo everything that Daphne said. I hope that next year, I expect that next year we can do it physically, because I think that's also a very important step in terms of where the university is and the role of history within the university. I can, again, really only echo, as a historian, as an academic historian, some of Daphne's words. I think that what we at the EUI, what the history department at the EUI can get out of Black History Month is the placing of Black history, of Blackness, of the history also of colonialism and racism at the heart of European history. I work specifically on 19th century history, and I think that these issues provide a very important key to understanding 19th century Europe. And I say this with the aim not merely of pluralizing European history, to say there's more than one kind of European history, but I think actually something a little bit more dramatic than that. I think that Black history, placed at the heart of European history, has the possibility of really changing the whole narrative of European history, of changing the protagonists, the heroes of European history. So I really want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank the speakers in particular for taking the time to talk to us. I owe a particular debt of thanks to Fatun and Daphne, who've really been pushing this forward, and it's been such fun and so interesting for me personally to work with them. I've learned an enormous amount from working with you both, Daphne and Fatun. And finally, I wanted to thank the EUI, the History Department, and the Schuman Center in particular for hosting it. And I'm now going to hand over to Fatun, who's going to introduce the speakers and chair the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Daphne. I'm Fatun Mohammed, and I'm a co-organizer of this series events with my colleague, lovely Daphne. Yeah, welcome everyone in our virtual roundtable. We're truly grateful to our guests today in their time to participate in what it's promised to be a spectacular debate. I hopefully. It was lovely to welcome all of you in Florence in person, but what you know, it's sort of impossible. And so thank you even more for participating in another event on Zoom. We all know it's stressful. So how I say, as my colleague Daphne already says, anticipating this roundtable wants to be in some way starting from the position of our guests in and their work context, obviously through their work. One of the reasons that motivate us to want to do this roundtable is because many countries in Europe, there are not specific courses or chair on Black studies or Black in everything about the Blackness in the academia. So this was something we was like to figure out today. If there are some either few recent or they are in Britain in particular, but in not in continental Europe, in a chair or a Black studies specific field in academia. So this was something we want to figure out, in particular that we come from a European university and institute, and just Lucy said before. So we believe that as part of broad and balanced curriculum, scholars should be educated about the different society and how different groups have contributed to develop of knowledge. So, and especially the voice of experiences, Blackness is very important. Sorry, I was muted? No.
It's all good. You can continue. It was just 1 second. Please go on.
Okay, so anyway, we believe that as part of a broad and balanced curriculum, scholars should be educated in about different society and how different groups have contributed to development of knowledge, and especially the voice of experiences of Black and Black people or African descendants in particular. So I will try to introduce an interdisciplinary and transnational way in this roundtable, and our first speaker today is Dr. Bolaji Balogun. Sorry, I'm very, very sorry for the name and mistakes. Is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow in Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield. He received his PhD in Sociology and Social Policy from the University of Leeds. And was a lecturer of Department of European Studies, Krakow University of Economics in Poland. Moise is a researcher interested including Blackness, race, and racialization in general Eastern Europe. His academic publication has appeared in prestigious journals such as Ethic and Rational Studies, Sociology, and Sociological Review. He is currently working on the first book-length monography, Race and the Color of Line, the Boundaries of Europeanness in Poland, the Examined and Race and Racism in Poland, to be published by Roundtable and founded by Leverhulme Trust. The floor is yours, Bobby. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Fatun, for the introduction. And also, thank you so much, Daphne, for the invitation to share my work with everyone here today. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I hope it's going to be something very, very brilliant. When Daphne first contacted me to be part of this event, I was so excited that I didn't know what to talk about. You know, I didn't really know where should I start. Should I go empirical? Should I go historical? But when I look at the theme of the conversation, I thought it would be interesting to share something with the people here today. And again, in the last few years, I've been really engaged in some sort of a lot of discourses around colonization, not the typical colonization as we know it in the West, the dominant account of, Spain, Britain, France, Portugal. Now, I thought it would be interesting to, shift away from the dominant account of this imperial power and look at the impact or the influence of colonization in Central and Eastern Europe by focusing particularly on Poland. So let me try to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm talking about here. I hope you can see my screen now. Okay, right. So in particular, I would like to share some of the images that I uncovered during my research, only as a way of redirecting and understanding of race, again, beyond the Western examples that we are all used to. So my intervention in this conversation would be some sort of attempt to relate the contemporary to historical. These points are very, very important: contemporary to historical and local to global. And I try to do this through three key manifestations that I identify within race and racism in Central and Eastern Europe, namely global colonial economy, colonization, and eugenics. Now, these three manifestations, in my view, they've been discussed extensively in Central and Eastern, in Western Europe, and as well in the Americas. But there has been not enough attention in this area in Central and Eastern Europe. So in the next few minutes I've got for the introduction, I want to speak directly to this manifestation, and I hope other speakers will be able to relate to them one way or the other. So the first manifestation that I wish to draw your attention to is the global colonial economy. So with this, I am interested, of course, in the traditional account of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Great Britain's colonial expansions. Now, they are dominant account, as I said before. What remains less known about this account of exploration is how these powerful European empires, how they managed to meet the human as well as, the material requirements for their expansion. Let's be honest, these countries, the countries we call great imperial nations, they are small countries. If you look at the geography of Britain, it's not a big country. Look at geography of, Spain, Portugal in particular. Portugal is so small in size, and yet Portugal managed to dominate, the large part of the world. But how did they manage to actually do, many of these, things that they went to do? This is where my research actually comes into contact with material wealth, which, AKA colonial expansion, the ways in which, materials are actually wealth are drawn from Central and Eastern Europe as exchanges, that went into things like shipbuildings. Without shipbuildings, Britain wouldn't have any chance of even colonizing half of the world. The same thing with Portugal. The resources for shipbuilding, in my view, they came largely, of course, many of them came from the colonies outside Europe, but large amounts of them were also supplied by, empires like Poland, Lithuania, Commonwealth. So I am interested in all these, less powerful European empires that are being thought of as not complicit, irrelevant to the transatlantic narrative of slavery. So this particular aspect of European expansion brings into focus, I argue, a very good example. Poland, Lithuania, Commonwealth might have contributed to, benefited from, and also helped with the maintenance of transatlantic slavery established by countries like Spain, Portugal, and expanded by countries like the Netherlands. So again, as probably you can see in the quotations there, according to my office, the colonial and industrial expansion of countries, not only of Holland and England, but Spain, Portugal, would have been almost impossible, would have been even as great as we're thinking about it today, without their contact and connection to Central and Eastern Europe. So what I'm trying to do here is actually to connect the local, which is Central and Eastern Europe, Poland in particular, to the global expansion of colonization outside Europe. I will leave that there for now. Let me quickly go on to my second manifestation, which I call colonization. Again, outside the well-circulated account of Spain, Portugal, and Netherlands, often identified as decolonizers, there has been limited accounts of colonization in relation to non-Europeans. In saying that, I am interested in what Guminda Barbara recently referred to as varieties of colonialism, as a way to unsettle this idea of colonialism as something that is often Western and that has, in my view, sort of very, very monolithic, Western process. But I mean, my literature doesn't really, say that. There are many aspects of also, European colonization that we could actually draw from in Central and Eastern Europe. So, for example, the image that you have in front of you, this picture here, the gentlemen sitting in that image, they are not French or Spanish or British, imperialists. No, far from it. These are actually Benedict and Stefan Schott-Rogodziński. These are early Polish explorer in Africa, as Fisher pointed out in that quotation. They use the local Black potters as servants, just exactly as the French would have done, just like the British have done, just like the Germans have done. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between actually these two gentlemen and the LA British or the Spanish or the Portuguese imperialists in Africa. So in fact, this particular exploration by Stefan Schott-Rogodziński is a 200 exploration. I argue was only a rehearsal for what was to follow in the 1930s by, through the establishment of what I call the Poland's Colonial Society, which probably not known to many people. Now, here is an area of colonialism that I would like to spend a bit of time on as an important aspect. of race. As somebody who is interested in racial discourse, I'm equally interested in the ways in which Polish colonial society used the idea of whiteness and Europeanness to demand for colonies in Africa and Latin America in the 1930s. Interestingly, at the time when this notion of the scrabble for Africa is already assumed to have ended, but yet we have a less powerful Eastern European country like Poland demanding for colony in Africa and Latin America. So an example of that, actually, the image you have right at the bottom of the screen with the red caption. For anyone who understands a bit of Polish, the cards that those people protesting that are carried, they actually read strong demand for colony for Poland. And the one at the bottom, the tiny one, again in the red, it reads, the destiny of Poland lies in the colony. Interestingly, as early as 1930s, Poland already demanding, that the material wealth be open to them in two particular areas of the world, Africa or Latin America, and in some cases, both of them. And there are so many steps actually that were taken to do this by the Polish colonial society. So for example, some of the images that you have on the other side of the screen, these are magazines by the Polish colonial society published almost every month as part of the propaganda to demand, for colony for Poland, which eventually actually got into, at the time, the League of Nations, that Poland might be allowed to have a colony, just like what we already know about the great imperial powers in Europe. If I may add one more layer to this, it'll be an interesting thought. When Walter Mignolo speaks about coloniality of being, I take it that he was referring to coloniality of knowledge in many areas of non-European life, most especially non-white people's life. And that coloniality of being, that argument is actually shaped by the notion of Christianity, whiteness, and Europeanness. Again, these notions, they've been fully established in Western Europe, in America. We know that when we say whiteness, we are actually referring to Christianity. And when we say Christianity, we're actually referring in another way to whiteness and Europeanness. This argument at the same time is also evidence in the ways in which Poland went about an attempt to apply the concept of coloniality of knowledge into Africa or non-white people, using Christianity as a code for whiteness and Europeanness. So a very good example of that is the image you have in front of you. So this is a cover of, again, a magazine called Muzynek. Anyone who understands Polish, again, will probably be able to know Muzynek actually means, well, it has several translations, contemporary translation. It could be Negro. It means little black person, a little Negro person, or the common terms as we probably know it, the little Sambo, as we probably know it in the West. Now, this is a cover of this magazine that was actually running from the 1914 up to after the 1938. And one of the images that we have in that magazine is quite interesting to see the ways in which whiteness is actually portrayed and the ways in which blackness is actually portrayed. And you can see there that a little black person embracing Christianity. There's a little picture there that says Jesus in Polish, Jesus kocham cię, meaning Jesus, I love you. And what is being loved there is a concept of whiteness, being assigned, to closer to God in a very interesting way. Not to take too much time on this, again, I'm happy to, expand this longer when we have time for more conversation. The final manifestation, which I find this very, very striking, and I feel like we don't talk about this enough, eugenics. A lot of people probably one way or the other might have actually come into contact with eugenics, but without knowing what it actually does in our life, right? What I'm talking about here is actually race science, pseudoscience as a common language that we know it to be. And in Central and Eastern Europe, eugenics was endemic. Interestingly, when we talk about eugenics, it's usually, again, just like colonization, the standard account, eugenics in the US, the way it actually, developed in the UK and then moved to the US, and the way it was actually used in Nazi Germany, the way it's been used, even in Italy. Interestingly, eugenics, exactly the same way that it was actually used in the West, was actually embraced also in Central and Eastern Europe. You hardly see any country in Central and Eastern Europe that came to nation formation in 1918 without their own eugenic society. And the chilling effect of eugenics, around 1930s, across Central and Eastern Europe, is the roles that it played within nation formation across that region. So, for example, at the peak of eugenic practices across Central and Eastern Europe, you name it, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Ukraine, identities of ethnic minority groups, gay populations, women in particular, and disabled people. These people's identity, they were actually constructed and actually divided between who is actually eugenic type and who isn't eugenic type, which would later have tremendous impacts on who is identified as Polish and non-Polish. So in essence, just as a way of just concluding this short introduction, the point that I've been trying to make is that the contemporary understandings of racism, they are produced, especially in Poland, within these three manifestations that are set out: the global colonial economy, colonization, and eugenics. And I hope people will be able to relate to them in different ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Bobby. You give us a lot to think, a lot to talk later with our guest. Now I will introduce our next guest, Mary Moise. Mary holds a BA in History from the University of Milano and the MA in Gender Studies from the University of Paris 7. And she had a PhD in September 2021 in Political Philosophy from University of Padova and Toulouse, with his dissertation entitled Not Yet a Woman, Not Longer Complete a Man, and Afrofeminism Reading and Political Subjectivation from Frantz Fanon. Her research focuses on the interdisciplinarity of gender, race, and class and political subjectivity. She is member of Jacobin Italia, editor, board on association expert from Anti-Racism Association Razzismo Brutta Storia. She has co-authored several collections of feminism and Afrofeminism essay, and she did a lot about Italian racism and so forth, so on. And now I hope I couldn't be able to see Mary, but yeah, Mary,
here I am.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Fortuna. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for the invitation. Well, this is what I would like to share today. As the Afrofeminist filmmaker Amandine Gay says, everybody needs a story of one's own. I approached Frantz Fanon without consciously knowing that I was looking for my own story. But that's what happened. Frantz Fanon, an Antillean man, a militant, who first theorized the psychic impact of racism. His story, the theoretical elaboration of his lived experience, echoed my own family biography. It is that of a family of slave descendants, of Marxist militants and unionists in the Asian countries, a family made of multiple unions between Black men and white women, a long family tradition of Black skins and white masks. a relevant presence of psychiatric diagnosis in all along the generations. My surname, Moise, daily recalled me the story I belong to. And the intertwining of Fanon biography and theoretical work gave me the meaning and the name to a long series of painful silent experiences. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon describes very well how the colonial-minded educational institution works. It teaches everywhere on the earth the white history of literature, the white history of philosophy, of military exploits, and so on. In Fanon's words, it teaches to Antillean people to recite the verb, our ancestors, the goals. This is what happens in the schools and universities in the Italian country, where the whitening of the courses of study is functional to the construction of a supposedly compact and white Italianity, which is exactly what a society that is not only white needs in order to keep its power to dominate on those who are not assigned to whiteness, by structurally and daily ordering them to aim at achieving that unattainable standard of whiteness. It is for this reason that in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon announces his intention to work, and I quote, on the level of failures, in the sense in which one speaks of engine failures, end of quotation. Blackness is thus conceived by Fanon as an infernal circle in which the Black is both locked and forced to vainly try to escape. Critically reworking the Hegelian master-slave dialectic through the lens of race, Fanon argues as follows. At the foundation of Hegelian dialectic, there is an absolute reciprocity, which must be emphasized. It is in the degree to which I go beyond my own immediate being that I apprehend the existence of the other as a natural and more than natural reality. If I close the circuit, I prevent the accomplishment of movement in two directions. I keep the other within himself. Ultimately, I deprive him even of those being for itself. End of quote. Like everyone else, I have internalized this approach throughout my studies and research, dealing with issues that are never enough philosophical, nor enough theoretical, in short, nor enough white. Once I was asked by one of my teachers if I had chosen to devote myself to these themes out of guilt toward Haitian people. In no less problematic cases, I have received exoticizing comments about my origins in which Haiti and Tahiti were confused, or I received always within the academy some inappropriate appreciations about the beauty of the Caribbean Sea just a few days after the earthquake that devastated the entire island of Haiti. As Fanon intuits, and then the Afrofeminist Grada Quilomba develops, race in this sense is that white artifact that keeps the Black body enslaved even after the formal abolition of slavery. That is, that white artifact that keeps the Black body enslaved to a past that does not pass, but that repeats itself, the infernal circularity, in every daily expression of structural racism. The distinction between past and present collapses, and the relationship between slave and master is reenacted. What Fanon analyzes in his work is the historical dynamics that keeps repeating itself and that Fanon describes it as follows. One day, the white master, without conflict, recognized the Negro slave. Historically, the Negro steeped in the inessentiality of servitude was set free by his master. He did not fight for his freedom. The Negro is a slave who has been allowed to assume the attitude of a master. The white man is a master who has allowed his slaves to eat at his table. What does it mean? And I quote Fanon again. One day, a good white master who had influence said to his friend, let's be nice to the N-word. The other masters argued, for after all, it was not an easy thing, but then they decided to promote the machine animal man to the supreme rank of man. This is a very important and problematic passage of Fanon's thought. Historically, it can be argued, it is not true that slavery was abolished by the sheer will of the white masters. The revolution of the Black Jacobins in Haiti and the role of the slaves and former slaves in the Civil War in the United States are historical proof of that. But at the same time, Fanon is right. The abolition of slavery in French West Indies, as much as it was preceded by slave revolts everywhere, is celebrated under the name of Victor Schœlcher, the politician who signed the decree that abolished slavery in 1848. But even beyond the historical truth debate, it is through this narrative that contemporary racism restructures itself. Let's be nice to the Black people. It is still the litany. And how can we be nice? What can we do for them? And so on. As Gloria Wecker-Shue, this is far from an innocent attitude that shifts the discourse to an ethical moral level and renews the invisibility of power structures by maintaining the infernal circularity of social and racial segregation. It is that attitude, by expunging Black history from the school curricula in Italy, that maintains the alienated relationship between Black history as a history of resistance and survival and the surviving sons and daughters of that history. There is a white power structures of white knowledge production that deliberately invisibilizes and denies the existence of a long past of struggle and resistance, and carefully prevent that this legacy get into the hands of the legitimate inheritors. Yet, not only does every person who, with origins in the Global South, inherit a history of colonization, but they can read that history through the lens that brings to light all those practices of self-defense and resistance and struggle that have allowed their families and their lives to come to this day. There is a urgency, I believe, to reconstruct every story of one's own on the epistemological premises, as Leonard Harris put it, of a philosophy born of struggle, the struggle for life and freedom. They will not pay anyone to do this work, just as they refuse to pay us for intervening today. And yet I thank the organizers for trying to get us paid. They will not support us materially, psychologically, or politically. And they will do so in the same of a presumed neutrality, equality, and objectivity. But once again, as Fanon taught me, scientific objectivity was bare to me. For the alienated, the neurotic was my brother, my sister, my father. And in response to this, and I conclude quoting Fanon one last time, there is only one solution: to fight. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Mary. You give us a lot to think. What Mary says about Italy, I think it's valid for many other European countries. Moreover, here Mary also talk about the positionality of Black research in academia and what's mean to produce knowledge in academia in Europe, but not only. It's very important concept. Let's go for now to our next guest. But thank you a lot, Mary. What do you say? Our next guest is Michael McEachrane. I hopefully say correct the surname. Is visiting research at the Raoul Wellings Institute of Human Rights and Human Rights in Law in Sweden, and the second international activist. Among his publications is the first book in English on people of African descendants in North region, Afro-Nordic landscapes, equality and race in Northern Europe, 2014. Currently, he is working on the anthology with original contribution in Sweden and the others, the colonial perspective, as well as a monograph that situation Black studies, Pan-Africanism and African diaspora in Sweden and Europe, and tracks some key topics on the human rights of people of African descendants. As an activist, Dr. McEachrane is, among other thinking, deeply involved in the international debate of people of African descendants, 2015 and to 2024, and the establishing the UN Parliament Forum of people of African descendants. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Fatun, and thanks to you and Daphne and your other co-organizers for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, which I think is a part of a beautiful initiative, the Black History Month, Florence. Okay, so to speak directly to the theme of the panel, let me say a few words about Black folk and Black studies in my corner of Europe, and namely Sweden. I've been told that the focus of this event should be on conversation and that I shouldn't speak for more than 10 to 15 minutes. So I will keep my remarks brief enough, I hope. Arguably, when considering Black people and Black studies in Europe, there are 4 general and outstanding conditions of being Black and doing Black studies in Europe, and not least in a country like Sweden. The first one of these is the widespread denial by European majority and mainstream societies that race is a socially, culturally, politically, and legally relevant category. A denial that stands in stark contrast to reality. Firstly, for example, as shown by the European Union Minorities and Discrimination Surveys by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, people with a non-European background or so-called people of color are especially discriminated against in all European countries and across all major areas of society, such as employment, housing, and education. Moreover, among so-called people of color in Europe, people of African descent and Roma tend to be the most discriminated. What this and very many other studies show is that European countries, in fact, are racially stratified. Secondly, except for perhaps nationality for non-EU citizens without legal residency in the EU, there is no other legally recognized ground of discrimination, be it gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity, or religion, with a greater impact on the equal enjoyment of dignity and rights in Europe than race. Still, after World War II and the racial ideology of Nazism and the Holocaust, all European countries, including Germany, became post-racial overnight, as it were. Since then, mainstream Europe sees itself, and contrary to all readily available data on the subject, to have moved beyond race, and insists that any mentioning of race is retrograde and threatens to fuel socially marginal beliefs in something that really does not exist. In Sweden too, race is rarely spoken of in politics, law, or mainstream media, and when it is, then through such euphemisms as national and ethnic origin, ethnic discrimination, people with foreign background, immigrants, and more recently, occasionally, skin color and people with a non-European background. On the other hand, mainstream Sweden has no problem whatsoever to speak of, recognize, and in various ways address gendered forms of oppression and inequality, and the need to mainstream gender equality in Swedish politics. For example, by having the world's first feminist government with equal gender representation among its ministers and gender equality considerations in all its policies, including in its foreign affairs. However, the fact that, for instance, in Sweden, Black men are more discriminated against on the job market than white women is not ever even considered. This situation of European post-racialism, as it were, which dismisses race as socially relevant and all race talk as based on retrograde fictitious beliefs in the face of Europe's systemic racism, racial stratification, and socially pervasive anti-Blackness, puts Black folk in this part of the world in a situation of invisible hypervisibility without even a socially acceptable language to unambiguously and precisely speak about our realities. The second condition of facing Black Europeans is the widespread state-sanctioned and mainstream denial that half a millennium of European colonialism and imperialism has shaped and continue to shape our world along racial lines, within as well as among countries, and that European countries bear some responsibility for this. There is arguably no man-made phenomenon, except perhaps for global warming, that has had a greater impact on our world than European colonialism and imperialism. However, you will not find anything like this in the history books in European public schools, nor in mainstream public and political discourse. For Black Europeans, there's arguably no single phenomenon in human history that has had and continue to have a greater impact on Black people as Black in Europe and across the world than European colonialism and imperialism. It has served to structure the social positions of Black people across European societies, as well as in former European settler colonies across the Americas, around the Indian Ocean, and elsewhere. It has served to structure the international positions of Black people too, including those of African countries and African descendant countries in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean. This is one of the many reasons why I personally cannot subscribe to Afro-pessimism, as it turns the experiences and institutions of enslavement into a singular Black experience, while failing to take into account, or at least properly so, their broader colonial and imperial contexts and how these have more broadly shaped the social and international positions and experiences of Black folk. The third condition facing us Black Europeans is that we are disparate communities without any ethnic, cultural, or indeed racial identities. For example, the demographics and history of people of African descent in Sweden are such that we cannot speak of any widely self-identified Black community here. And in this, Sweden is not much different from most, if not all, other European countries. At least 2% of Sweden's population of approximately 10 million residents are Black. The great majority of us are either born in or have one or two parents who are born in the Horn of Africa. For example, Somalia, Eritrea, or Ethiopia. The rest of us are mostly first or second generation Swedish residents with a background in other African countries, such as Gambia, Nigeria, or Kenya, whereas a minority of us, probably no more than 5%, have, like myself, backgrounds in other parts of the African diaspora, such as the Caribbean, Latin America, and the US. What this means is that we are without any joint ethnic, cultural, or racial identities, nor even a recognized collective history in or in relation to Sweden. Very much more may be said about this Black European condition, which sets us as Black Europeans apart from, for instance, Black Americans. The fourth and final condition is the condition of Black studies in Europe. It should come as no surprise to anyone that Black studies are marginalized in Europe, and that those of us who do Black European studies in Europe, in contrast to those who do Black European studies in the US, are marginalized too, and have no, or if any, very little institutional backing. To take my own case as merely one of many, very many similar examples across Europe, I have never held a full-time university position in Europe, no part-time position that has lasted for more than 6 months, despite there being professorships in post-colonial studies, university centers that do research on racism, state-funded university programs across the country on immigration and ethnic relations, universities that have enabling ethnic diversity as among their key missions as universities, etc. Needless to say, you will not find any academic programs in Black studies at any level at any university in Sweden. Still, these 4 conditions of Black folk and Black studies in Europe may also be turned into sources of empowerment. For example, if we think that social and international orders, including those of European societies and Europe's place in the world, should be firmly based on a concern for human dignity, rights, and non-discrimination, then our positions as Black people in Europe offer keys to the sort of work that needs to be done. And if we think that universities, not least state universities, have critical democratic functions to play, and that the production of knowledge should not be disconnected from social contexts and values and be socially engaged, then Black European studies may be seen as at the forefront of such considerations. All right, thank you. That's it.
Thank you a lot, Michael. Wow, a lot of questions coming out here. As we all know very well, the European context cannot be seen or studied without considering its relationship with Blackness or Black history. Again, here coming out, who has title to talk about the issue like colonialism, colonial legacy, racism, and moreover, the question I was wondering is what history are we creating, or for whom, for who? So, but yeah, we have time later to talk about. Now I will introduce our last but not least guest, Dr. S.A. Smythe. Is a poet, translator, and assistant professor of Black European culture and study of contemporary Mediterranean study and the Black trans poetic at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. There they research a relation aspect of Black belonging and belong borders. They are also a senior fellow at the Center of Appliance of Transgender Studies. Smythe is the editor of Topple the Ground, Global and Configuration of Blackness, Nativism and Indigenous special issue for postmodern culture and the where Blackness meets the sea on crisis culture and the Black Mediterranean winter of the 2022 Rome Prize. Smythe is currently based between Rome, Antonia, and Los Angeles. Welcome, Essay, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fartun. It's me, Essay Smythe. Thank you so much for the invitation, Daphne, Fartun, Lucy. I'm just going to time myself and dig in because I'm actually just really much more excited for the conversation. Michael, I especially just really want to chat with you. There's going to be so much overlap in our pieces, but I also want to slip in Black feminism as the thing that could make our different interventions sort of a point of possible convergence. Just really quickly, I'm not going to be talking about the book that Fartun talked about because I took seriously the prompt. And again, shout out to you all, as Bobby and others have said, in terms of the struggle for doing your work and making yourselves manifest. It's also, I just wanted to speak to people who are here for that because in the description it talked about national context, and just to be very clear and get to the end, at the very core, I do not believe in a national context. So I'm definitely coming to this conversation as a Black feminist abolitionist. And I think when we're talking about white supremacy, which to be clear, we are talking about that, we need to think beyond national or indeed transnational or neo-national borders and how they silo us from another. So I'm just going to begin or keep going. Academic scholarship, literature, and other creative articulations and formations of Blackness in Europe have gained increasing mainstream attention in the last decades. And of course, the brilliant work of my roundtablists are a testament to this, not the newness of the work, but that we are able to convene here to the work of the roundtablists and of course, the organizers. As Michael spoke a little bit about, I'm speaking from the other side of this as someone who got a PhD from the United States and is employed in the United States. When Black students, PhD or otherwise, who are socialized in relation to Europe have been made for financial and other political reasons to turn to the US to be able to study and engage with contemporary articulations and historical articulations of Blackness in and beyond Europe in Black studies departments, which, as Michael pointed out, do not exist. What does this tell us about the workings of US centrism in relation to Blackness, but also about the continuous erasure of Blackness in Europe in physical, societal, institutional, political, epistemological, temporal, and spatial dimensions? I spelt it out, but I mean every dimension. How are these discourses flattened when they travel? And how can we be more attentive to the various heterogeneities of Blackness that shape various European contexts, as well as their relations to the formations of Blackness in the US and globally? While the presence of Black people in Europe dates before the early medieval period, there's been a tendency to tie the imagined project of Black Europe to a notion of citizenship born out of contemporary nation states and remaining within colonial liberation formations of rights. A question that I always ask in relation to my research and politic on Blackness and belonging is, do we want the state to love us or do we want to be free? And who, as Michael also asked, is we as we struggle toward a collective definition of something like liberation? This organizing tendency is not only ahistorical, but it also fails to acknowledge how Black people in Europe have contributed significantly to archives of radical Black epistemologies and methodologies globally in various and substantial ways. subsuming the multiplicities of European Blackness as ontology, identity, or alignment under the framing of so-called Black Europe thus entails certain risks, especially with regard to the reproduction of the nation or the supranation as Europe, and of citizenship as liberal frameworks that always already abject the multiplicities of Blackness. Simultaneously, it has become increasingly clear that within the last few years, the effort to think what Blackness even is in European context demands an attentiveness to the distinct points of departure in terms of the varying socio-historical conditions that inform what constitutes Blackness, the divergences of anti-Blackness in European nation states, as well as the intersectional dimensions of Black positionalities and vulnerabilities. Perhaps we'll have time to talk about this, but I want to be very explicit as we are in 2022, that when I say intersectional or intersections, I do not mean an additive model where we add, say, Black plus woman, and then we get Black woman, but actually the definition that was wrought by a Black feminist, Kimberly Crenshaw, to actually talk about the intensified, transformed position of those things constituted in one person. Right, so I do not mean, it matters, and I hope we get some time to talk about it. And also when I say anti-Blackness, sorry, this is why I don't, I write notes and then I say things, but another point possibly for discussion, I talked about anti-Blackness, which is also not a neologism, but it is sort of a recent trending when we talk about things like racism. And so I do want to speak about that. But when I'm talking about Black studies and Black study in a singular, I'm coming from a political theoretical position by Trinidadian political scientist, C.L.R. James, who has taught us and is often cited as this, that Black studies and its critiques are the critique of Western civilization. And if we think about what the West is and where it permeates and how it organizes our relationship to self and to community, to nation and border, I'm also talking about anti-Blackness as a constitutive feature of the modernity that is organizing our lives every day. So I do not just mean not liking Black people or, you know, having personal feelings, but this structured bedrock that organizes our daily lives, even on Zoom. So it is important to think beyond the borders that continue to be forged around us and to think about who we mean when called to think Black and Blackness in Europe. Black people rendered non-citizen within Fortress Europe and in the centers, the urban insurrections in the aftermath of police killings of Black youth across Paris, London, Stockholm, as well as other European cities and other European countries, and of course in response to US cities. Mobilizations against anti-Black imagery and representations in public spaces, such as those against Zwarte Piet in the Netherlands, also linked to public manifestations in colonial occupied spaces in the Caribbean, like Suriname. Blackface in German and Swiss theaters, struggles for the decolonization and the material decolonization, not just swapping a syllabus, but actual decolonization of educational institutions, of street names, struggles for decolonization and return, restitution, abolition, and reparation of colonial museums, and material memories of enslavement, colonialism, imperialism, and its aftermath, not only speak to the current conjectures of Blackness in Europe, but again signify the importance of these formations and struggles as radical contributions to the global formations of Blackness, the Black radical tradition, and Black feminist freedom, visions, and horizons. Engaging with the relational lived experiences and struggles of Black people across these various contexts in and beyond Europe is really useful to sort of anticipating the conversation that I'm hoping that we'll have today. Both, you know, in my work in particular, when I'm thinking of the Black Mediterranean, just as a point to end on, I will happily share what I mean by this, but as a snippet, I just want us to sort of note the sea and acknowledge actually that the Black Mediterranean and the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean are linked bodies of water. And it's rather not a conversation about seeking representation within an ontological or epistemological frame of study, which is to say, to push Black Europe, which is why I'm concerned with it as an organizing feature, up against what we think we know when we talk about Black America or Black Americanness, but actually rather to say these are constitutive bodies, geographical scapes, landscapes and histories that are actually connected. And the transatlantic slave trade would be unthinkable without the Mediterranean Sea on a geological, geographic, political level, but also in another multivalent way, what we come to think about as Blackness would not be thinkable without other permeated Atlantic cultures that do not include the US. And so of course I'm thinking and ending on the Caribbean because I'm Jamaican and we have to end with our shells. Big up, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you a lot to say. Thank you very much. So now we thank you all of our speakers, and they give us a lot to think about. We had a lot to think about right now. Now, if you have any question or anything to say, please go ahead.
Yes, maybe I might start if you don't mind. Thank you all of you for like this great contribution. I think the point that SA made on going beyond the national or transnational international frame, it's really important. But I was wondering, if you all touched on the question of colonial legacy and colonial memory, and if we think that Black experience is framed, maybe not frame is not the right term, but it's influenced or determined also according to this colonial heritage and legacy. How do you, this is a really wide question, but how do you balance the different context of, like, for example, Sweden, that was not a formal, or Poland, that was not a formal colonial power, and Italy that was. How do you balance then these different context of colonial legacies to, and not to come back to this kind of like, national focused, frame? Like, this is a really wide question, I'm sorry, but any of you who wants to say something on it, I would be really interested.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, Daphne. It's a very good way to actually start the conversation. And particularly for me, give me the chance to actually unpack a little bit of some of the things I actually left behind. I think the point of your question really is to think about, colonization or even colonialism, or, coloniality of being, or even race or racism, not really as a national project as such. Of course, many of these things, they have local manifestations, but we need to think about their, circulation as a global thing, rather than, the UK, the US, and of course, if you look, there are similarities, there are differences in the ways in which, colonization is actually being used, even racialization, they work in different ways. If we, move across to Central and Eastern Europe, of course, you will see something completely different. These things are shaped by the, historical understanding or different backgrounds of, different population and citizenship. But the most important thing, what we find is overlap, within many of these nations. And that's why the idea of national projects doesn't really work very well. Rather, I argue to look at the ways in which the local engages with, global. This is a global thing that we need to actually take on. And anywhere, probably most part of the world you go to, if you look at, the hierarchization of human being, you're almost likely to find a Black person right at the bottom of it. It's a global, it seems to me like a standard thing. It's not natural, it's something that's actually created in the categorization of human beings, and then make to look, global. So it's a global thing we're engaging with here. rather than looking at national thing. If I might come a bit closer into my own study, the silence about race and even colonization in Central and Eastern Europe is striking. So I just find the old narrative and account of this topic it's too linear to me. It's too Western, So when we the question I often ask myself, and perhaps people on the panel is, when we are done with the notions of race and racism in the West, how do we deal with the one in the East if we don't carry Eastern Europe along now? Because the way in which I think most of the narratives about race and colonization is still, looking from the Western, perspective, without us looking at what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe now and try to project that into the global effects in one way or the other. We'll be able to actually, address what goes around. So we need to think about this as a kind of global event rather than a local event.
Thank you, Bobby. Michael, please.
Thank you. Yes, I would just like to add a few words to what Bobby just said, and I agree with everything you said, Bobby. And with regards to Sweden and colonialism, as Bobby already has pointed out. So first, maybe these national distinctions between which European countries actually colonized and which did not. Is in this context not as relevant perhaps as one might imagine, as colonialism, if we think of it as broader than colonization per se, and more in terms of coloniality as, if you will, an international matrix of power, where colonialism was something that had both social, domestic dimensions and international dimensions, and ordered the world both at the domestic level and internationally along racial lines, including in Europe. There is no European country that does not include a white European identity as a part of its nationhood and national identity. And also all European countries are a part of an international order that has, that privileges white people and white European countries and former European settler colonies, such as the US, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. So that is one point, general point that echoes what Bobby said. And now we haven't even said anything about the global cultural circulation of race and its meanings. Then another point regarding Sweden is, and this is something, I think it's perfectly understandable for you to think that Sweden has not itself colonized anyone ever, because this is the image of Sweden, that Sweden has been very good at selling to the world. But Sweden actually has colonized, and it colonizes as we speak. Also, the northern part of Sweden, Sápmi, is by the Sami, the indigenous people of Sweden, considered to be colonized. Then Sweden did colonize for almost 100 years. Saint Barthélemy in the Caribbean, Saint Barth as it's often referred to today, which was an not insignificant free port in the transatlantic traffic. And so, and there are some other examples. So Sweden did actually participate in colonization as such as well, not to mention the many ways in which Sweden did participate to contribute to, and also also gained economically from the transatlantic trade, in terms of, for instance, contributing with most of the iron that was used in the transatlantic trade for a long time was Swedish iron. And of course, Sweden, as other European countries, also benefited from all the cheap colonial goods, including sugar, that used many thousands of enslaved Africans and people of African descent to produce the sugar that Sweden consumed each year, and not to mention other colonial goods such as coffee, tobacco, cotton, and so forth. So there are many ways in which Sweden and all other European countries have been a part of European colonialism.
Thank you, Michael. We have Tinasha, who has a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. A very fascinating discussion. I'm really not a scholar of Black studies, but I just came in just to listen and also appreciate the sort of ongoing debates around this topic, because I was prompted because this morning at my institute, we were discussing about the politics of citation. And one of the key issues I think that came out within that discussion was when it comes to citation of a scholarship, there are these power structures that also manifest in terms of which scholarship is cited and which scholarship is given prominence. And one of the issues obviously that came out was that there is heavy citation of scholarship from the global north at the expense of global scholarship from the global south. But I think, again, if you look at it to bring in sort of Bobby's conceptualization of the hierarchies that are involved, you again have these hierarchies in terms of citation, where obviously you find Black scholars right at the bottom of the hierarchy. So I wanted us to sort of reflect a little bit on that, because I thought maybe it might be very relevant as we think about the politics of knowledge production within this whole discussion that we are having. Because if you're saying that let's sort of move away from this notion of nation state, but look at the global structures of power relations. We also need to sort of look at the politics of knowledge production, and the notion of coloniality and knowledge production. And for me, I'm sort of again referring to Bobby, and I think also Michael touched a bit on it around the order, or what Foucault calls the order of things in his seminal work around episteme. And so for me, the question that I really have is, yes, you have sort of laid out the case quite well, but how then do we sort of proceed in terms of decolonizing these structures that are existing, especially Michael, I think you spoke quite passionately around the challenges that you have when it comes to Sweden. You don't have any chair for Black studies, or you have very minimal opportunities for Black studies. So for me, I think it sort of calls for Black scholars to put on the other hat as Black academic activists, as it were, and say, how do we challenge these structures of power? How do we create space in a more decolonial sort of kind of thinking? So my challenge to the speakers, yes, you have sort of highlighted the challenge quite well, but what then? How do we proceed? What do we need to do? What needs to be done sort of to challenge these structures of power that are in place that again continue reproducing the existing power relations when it comes to knowledge production? I don't know, I'm just sort of rambling. It's not my area, but I thought maybe I should bring it out. And I don't know whether my question is clear or whatever I'm trying to say is clear, but I just thought I should let it out and find out from you who are the sort of experts in the area. Thanks.
Can I jump in, Daphne? Right. Tanisha, thank you very much for your question. It's a very, very broad question. It's a very, very difficult one. While you are speaking, I was really thinking intensively that what you are alluding to is too many things. For me, I mean, the starting point will be, again, I go back to Walter Mignolo when he speaks about the coloniality of being. And I relate that to coloniality of knowledge. And this has been documented. I mean, look, when we mention the leading scientists in the world, they're all whites, mainly whites. You know, it's only graduate. In fact, it's high grade that it's only in the US that, you know, Black scholars actually started to come into leading, you know, stuff across the world. And this is also related to wealth, because, I mean, it's whoever who's got plenty of money to spend around that will be able to influence people about their, whether it's a genuine or not genuine argument, that will be able to cut across, you know, many, many things. Many of the things that have been carried out, it's mainly about, largely about wealth, you know. So one way of starting, you know, the challenge you set before us at Tunisia would be what we are doing now is a starting point. It's one way of actually, everybody goes back to their, you know, different areas of life and trying to influence policies, decisions, establishment of safe spaces. Again, I continue to refer to the US, where they have, you know, I mean, probably I say we'll be able to speak directly to these fully established white and Black, you know, universities, organizations that are thriving on their own, doing their own interesting stuff. In Europe, we barely have that, you know, we barely, I mean, they will even see that as complete segregation. So it's very, very important that people are given opportunities, you know, to express themselves, to do, you know, their own stuff. That's one way of going about doing one of these, you know, things that you said before us. The second thing I was going to say was, I mean, it's hard for me to say this, you know, what happened to George Floyd? I cannot believe that it would take that long for, you know, a very, very global event to happen about, you know, Black Lives Matter, when people have been talking about Black Lives Matter for a very long time. But the event, the killing of George Floyd, really made, you know, tremendous changes, at least from what I know in the UK, and even in Poland, where you don't even get to hear about, you know, Black Lives Matter at all. You heard the Black Lives Matter campaign now. A lot of Black people are now talking about, you know, how Black, you know, life matter in Poland. So, for example, in the UK, there's been a lot of restructuring of, you know, policies and organizations. Like, for example, in my own department in Sheffield, I mean, as you probably will imagine, geography is wide. I mean, when you say geography, you're talking about, within geography, which is so broad, within geography, you have so many things. Colonization is barely, you know, spoken about. But now, you know, looking at what's happened with the whole Black Lives Matter thing, with the whole George Floyd there, and then COVID pushed everything, you know, under, there's now a lot of restructuring about now we need to change the whole stabbing process. We cannot continue to have white people, you know, dominating the entire thing. We need to, you know, mix things up. Gradually, we see things happening again at the top. The people that are actually, you know, making decisions about policies, they're now injecting, you know, black faces or brown faces. Why that's interesting to see, it's also important to see that these are not just only about policymaking. We need to see that these things are actually not in theory, but they're actually translating that into practices where Black people will be able to, to thrive and, do interesting stuff and move on with interesting way of life. So just to summarize with this, Tanisha, it's a long process when it comes to even the citation that you talk about. But one thing I will encourage you, just if I may give this advice, is if you have a very good research, you'll be able to get somewhere with it. It might take a while, if you have a very good argument to make, very good research, wherever you come from, if you work very, very hard. I know it's very, very hard, especially for people of color to get anywhere, but I don't want you to get pushed back by the notion that, well, my work will never be cited anywhere. No, don't be, forget that completely. Go on and do your own work as much as you could. Opportunity will come one way or the other. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Bobby. I would like to ask Essay or Mary if they have something to add or would like to say something, please.
Unfortunately, I have to leave you, so I would like just to add a quick little contribution to all the two questions that have been made. First, concerning the transnational nature of white supremacy, view by from Italy, I think I totally agree with the importance to analyze the circulating process of thinking, of colonial thinking and colonial goods as the two faces of the same project of supremacy. For example, concerning Italy, I would like to mention Cesare Lombroso's work, which is considered the father of the criminal anthropology, and who one of the first scholar in Italy theorizing a sort of, racial inferiority of Southern Italians. But if you read his work, you can find all the study he made, for example, on Haitian people, on the Haitian Revolution, analyzed with completely racial and racist lenses that allowed him to construct and theorize the racial nature of Southern people in Italy. I mean, there is an already theorized categorization of Black people who become the basis of the thinking of Lombroso, for example, and moreover, concerning goods and circulation of colonial goods, Italianity is built on the cultural food habits. For example, pizza, which is of course based on the colonial circulation of tomatoes and how tomatoes became the symbol of Italianity. There is an important and not already studied history of colonial circulation and colonial participation of Italy in the colonial project and in the white supremacy, which has to be told. And concerning the colonial perspective and a critical analysis of academy, I just think it is not the answer, but just a little thinking. I think of the urgency of independent knowledge production sites beyond academy, completely independent beyond white academy in order to challenge the white power of academy. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fortune. I'm going to try for succinctness. Tinashe, thank you for your comment and question. I think that decolonization is impossible in the context that we are having it here. I'm going to cite two African thinkers. One, Frantz Fanon, when in Wretched of the Earth, he talks about on violence, right, which is not just a manifesto. It's not just about like armed struggle or physical violence, but he actually talks seriously in this anti-colonial moment about decolonization. And Fanon acknowledged it is a complete and total transformation, a radical from the root break with the past. That will not happen by me throwing some Africans onto a syllabus and calling it a day. It also won't happen when I view that as the starting point for a radical transformation that may take 50 years. I want to be very clear about this. It needs machetes, you know what I'm saying? It needs not a Zoom call that is recorded by the European University, EUI. It doesn't need me, a professor at UCLA. It doesn't, right? I want to be very clear because this is not my activism. Tinashe, you talked a little bit about, you know, a scholar, activist, you know, like an intervention in this way. My activism is like in the sea with people who are refugees and migrants. My activism looks completely different than what I represent within an ivory tower that, as Marie has pointed out, is white. Another thinker is Amilcar Cabral, right? Bissau Guinean, Cape Verdean thinker, engineer, doer, who lets us know that violence is an interruption of colonial domination. And so when we're thinking about decolonization, the second part of the reason that we cannot think about it in this incremental sort of way that Fanon would have laughed us out of a room about is also that domination part of colonial domination that Cabral teaches us, right? Domination means domination. It itself is also totalizing. So if I am in this system, a Black, British, Caribbean person, I am also dominated and subjugated within it. This is why we need things like Black feminism and relational intersectional thinking so that we don't have a sort of binary. I'm obviously coming in as a non-binary person. We have a conversation where we're thinking about the North and the South, while there are people like Michael has taught us about the Sami people, like in Italy, where I also am, as well as Marie, the Roma people, Sinti travelers, right? Domination takes on different forms and we need to really acknowledge it. I'm not saying you're not, I'm saying we, the we that I'm hailing in this Zoom call, it needs us to recognize that that we shifts on a regular basis. And no one is more frustrated than I when I have to have Americans talking to me about Black European life and possibility. It, you know, it really grinds my gears, so to speak. But I also then acknowledge in the global struggle, which is why I say this, to say the way that we're thinking about colonialism and colonization may need a bit of work, may need some thinking. And also, as Marie is saying, maybe not just in the academy or the institutional ways, because Black thought has been fundamentally subsumed and consumed on the land that is Turtle Island, which is to say North America, not just the United States, right? African Americans, Black American people speak to me when I live there in English. I'm speaking to you all now in English. Marie is speaking Fortune. People who have English as a first language are speaking to us in English right now. But this is not then to take a view where we then turn it around and say, well, why are we not having this in now what language, right? Now we are, what Fanon talks to us about as well, chasing a ghost of sort of a pre-colonial moment that will never happen again. I repeat, it will never happen again. So this means that we need to reorganize and ourselves be rooted. And this is also violence, but it's internally violent work. Again, it's not just machetes, let that not be whoever's doing the tweeting, don't just, but, work of radical transformation that says the past that I wish could be recuperated, I need to mourn and grieve that. But what is to come? What is next for us and who is us? Right? So that I'm not now going to try isiSulu or like choose a language and find it, acknowledge that people who are speaking isiSulu now, that may not have also been their languages because borders fell on them and those tribes and communities, right? Sudan is now Sudan and South Sudan, but these are mutable things and we need to take that seriously so that we can actually get somewhere. I want to, as a last note, recently, as Fortune has pointed out, edited this volume on Blackness, nativism, and indigeneity so that we can have a global conversation about this. reflecting on how Blackness is sort of voided out from indigeneity so that people cannot think about enslaved people as indigenous people, when indigenous means you came from a place and might be in diaspora to it, but there's a place that you call home, this sort of de-homing of Black peoples in the United States. And as a quick aside, while I'm ranting, I say Black peoples and not bodies, because I do not want to do the epistemologically violent work, avoiding Black life and Black possibility by relegating us to a body and a corp. And that's not English, but a physical shell and form, but Black people, Black life, Black thinkers and doers and makers, right? And so when we think about these sorts of things, and then about how, because the question also involves like what we as the people on the panel would do and think about, and thank you to the roundtablers for the intervention and the conversation. There is no we that can transform a structure and a system on an individual basis. I specifically in this, because I can give this concrete example, tried to reach out to Global South or African specifically and Caribbean writers, not just in the academy. And I couldn't change their conditions because I'm one person and I live and I'm of the West, whether or not I consented to this, by which I concretely mean, could I step in and get the childcare? Could I step in and pay for the licensing fees when I had a student's budget, which is itself a kind of privilege, as we're literally talking about by nature of being at a US institution where I could have some kind of a budget to partially give? Could I pay for the internet fees of the Sudanese writer who was really interested in submitting in the time frame for the issue, where there was no stable Wi-Fi, right? These things are connected in such a way that even at the end of the day, say some of those things were possible and some movements were made that the individual person taking on a project tries to pursue, then we get the publication. But then that publication cannot be read because there are no licensing fees. This is something I literally had to learn about in this process. Even if that African writer or a Global South person is in the volume, they can't even go back and access it and disseminate it as we're talking about because of the European wide laws or the North American wide laws that mean that I cannot share the information that we produce. So again, I think Marie is right in terms of non-academic interventions, although that might be a longer and separate conversation that may belie some other kinds of boundaries, because when I'm in activist spaces, there are students there. The Third World Liberation Front involves students, right, who are also getting some information and sealing it and disseminating it from universities. So maybe not the kind of academy, capital A, that is itself white supremacist and organizing our lives and thought, but a smaller kind of academy that we just must acknowledge when so many Black thinkers even rendered transient or permanent, whatever that means with inverted commas, as like Michael was also pointing out, the sort of distinction of like permanent position, right? We do need to reflect on who we are and what we can meaningfully do. And sometimes the questions that we ask around that are actually organized on the same principles that are themselves obstructing our ability to transform our conditions. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. It's very inspiring. Yeah, before I go with the Lucy, which had a question, I would like to say something. Mary and I, we have already talked about this, but it's interesting to think about the fact that the Black people or Black scholars are always activists inside them. In particular, the space where they live in academia, or not in academia, if I would like to say in academia, but it's something you have to do. For example, one the difficulty is to manage the thinking, go outside the thinking white supremacy thinking. It's something very deeply with our work. Anyway, I don't know if Lucy is there, but she had a question.
Lucy had to go because she has another event.
And also, I haven't anything to add to everything that's been said, but I hope we can have another occasion to have more of this conversation. So thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, Lucy. Thank you. Is there Tiffany, please?
Tiffany?
Yes, actually, the question that I had was answered already. It was about the fact that Black people in the US are so removed, right? It's not really possible for those of us who are the descendants of formerly enslaved people to find connections to the continent, so to speak. And so the ownership of the US that we're denied from having, I would agree that at this point we can't, let's just say, be cute about it anymore. And we have to just say, well, that's too bad because it's our blood, sweat, and tears that built this country. So, what are we gonna do? And apologies for having my camera off. My internet connection is terrible. But anyways, being a Black scholar in Europe for a number of years now, I was very surprised at the reaction to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I thought to myself, well, I've been telling you all about this for years since I've been here, and no one believed it was as bad as it is. But now that they're having the conversation, it's almost been more of an opportunity, or there's been more of a push to do something, whatever that something is, in Europe than what I've experienced being born and raised in the US. So the removal, so to speak, is something that I feel like I've found more opportunity to address that individually, getting out of the US and finding other Black people who are not from the US, but there's still some sort of struggle to differentiate American Blackness, particularly United States American Blackness, from European Blackness. And it's not that I don't understand where that's coming from. I understand that US American Blackness kind of takes over the conversation. And my response is always, well, it really is that bad, right? I didn't have the opportunity to grow up in a place where everyone looked like me and things of this nature. So yeah, I feel like it was addressed, this fact that there was such a deep removal. We don't have a language to go back to. We don't have a country or a land to go back to. So, how do we kind of, to use the term that was used earlier, also take up our own, perhaps proverbial machetes and do something about the lack of justice, right? But yeah, I see that the hand is raised, so I'll stop talking. I'm not sure there was a question there. But I appreciate any reflections on this, because it's merely a reflection for me as well.
Thank you. Essay?
Please, that's fine. You want to comment on this?
Daphne, you wanted to respond, or?
Yes, go on, please.
Oh,
please.
okay, sorry,
Please.
I didn't see the hand. No, of course, I appreciate the conversation that you have been steeped in, Tiffany. I just want to say two things, because I know I just spoke. One is maybe this is a little bit where decolonization thinking comes in, because when I hear, blood, sweat, and tears built this land, I'm also thinking about African-American, Native American sort of solidarities, and to say it didn't because it was built, but the land, the blood and the torture and the labor extracted from enslaved Africans and African-Americans in that wake matters, but it mattered to an imperial project, and y'all can make it matter differently. Now, I know that that's not an individual thing, but that is just sort of one of the things that I think about. And when I teach in an African-American studies department to African-Americans who are like, it's my country, there's something that scholars have thought about, Jen Heritzhorn and many, many others, called traumatized citizenship. And that doesn't mean that individual people are traumatized, so please don't misunderstand, but rather the state of affairs where I worked for this and we fucking made it. Sorry for my French, which is, you know, right? But we did this, right? We were subjected to this and we are owed, but there is something else that is possible through the very same anti-colonial tendencies that we can learn from the continent, right? And then I wanted you to say the second quick point, and I don't know if Michael or others want to speak to this, Bobby, but, you know, when I was, you know, spent part of my childhood in the UK and then also in Jamaica, Costa Rica, but I spent whole years not ever seeing a person who looked like me, not even in my family. So I just want to sort of name that too, that the people who we don't share, there's a traumatized citizenship also in that direction. I just wanted to say that so that it's not just the US case alone or the North American case broadly, but there are people that when I talk about, you know, do we want the state to love us or do you want to be free? And I go to Hamburg and I go to Paris and I go to these different places across Europe to, like, you know, preach my word and talk about my book. All the time I get young Black people from those places meeting me and I'm like, let's just go get a drink. I know what's coming. And they talk about not seeing anybody. Well, at least in the UK and at least in the US, you had people who look like you. And I'm actually just really wanting to drive the point home that this is not the conversation that we need to be having, right? These feelings matter, but they matter in the lowercase m, I might have therapy or family to talk to sort of way, not, and I have a therapist, this is great. Not in the way of we make transformative, structural, anti-colonial, decolonial, transformative change from this. So you were the only one. We're not going to do Oppression Olympics and then look to the UK because I can name 5 Black British actors, or the US where I might name 50, but you didn't have a Black teacher, because we actually don't know the reality of individual people. And when we think structure, Black women in the United States, even in 2022, if someone's a woman who gives birth and is Black, that woman is 37 times more likely to die. Those are the numbers of Black women in Uganda. Are we really going to have a conversation about nation state when white supremacy is not having those conversations on our bodies, right? So we don't need to attach to a national project, even if one tries to attach through blood and violence into us. We just don't need to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. I have last question for essay, and then if the speakers want to add before we go into to the end. My question for you is, Stan, I would like to ask you, what does it mean to work in Italy on the issue of Blackness? Because in Italy, Black, we are so far having certain discoursing in public sphere, but you are in Italy right now, and you work in some way with Italian people. If you would like just to tell us your experience, because you have, you know, the comparison from Italy and not Italy and outside, because it's very, I think it's a very peculiar space in Italy. Thank you.
I want the last word to go to Bobby and Michael, especially Michael. So I'm just going to be as quick as possible and say, beloved Fortune, it is not peculiar. It is actually the same story, but a different day. Everyone's got, right? We can all say, even with our backgrounds, we all have a family, no? Some of us had 2 parents, some of us even 3, because we had, you know, different kinds of kinship structures of who parented us. Some of us have 1 sibling, some of us were only children, some of us had 7 or whatever, right? But we all had a family. And I think, you know, when we think about the particularities, we are forged in this family sorts of unit in a way that's like, well, I was an only child and you have 2 siblings and you know what it was, right? That might shape part of your experience, but I really want us to and I'm speaking to the us in Italy now, Fatun, so I got you there, right? Speak to because in my experience with talking to Black Italian people or people of Black Italy in this way that I, don't really like these kinds of labels I was talking about, but I just mean people who are Black in this space, right? Not people who identify with the nation. It actually is more difficult than, this is the most difficult aspect of my book. And I really relish these conversations, but this is when I started to deepen my theorization around traumatized citizenship, right? Because I don't know how many more times, and I know that this is a recorded conversation, so I'm gonna reel it back. But sitting with Black Italian people or Black people in Italy when they talk to me about how difficult it is because, well, the Eritreans developed and then the Nigerians and there's different communities. These are material problems. These are problems, Michael even again spoke to this a bit in terms of the different kinds of development and the lack of an us that is just a Black of us. But there was also the claim that sort of like Black Americans had this, but I've lived in the States and there's a Californian who will talk to a New Yorker until they don't, there's also striations that happen like it's sort of a football match as opposed to a broader concerted project of racial domination. And so I just mean quite seriously, I would love to figure out a way to sort of skip this step, even though I understand the step is also the work. When I'm speaking to Italian people who are talking about, yes, but of course I am Italian. And you see, I love pizza. I'm sorry Maria is not here because I take a little drinking game in my head, peace to my liver when I hear a Black Italian tell me, it's always the same, right? I'm, of course, from Italy. I love pizza and the pasta, and you see how it's always the same like traits. But what if somebody who comes off the Mediterranean Sea and doesn't like, is senza glutine or something? What if somebody is allergic to tomatoes or something like, I don't know. I'm just saying, is this how we're making our claim to land and its histories and its legacies? Or are we saying something else? Are we making a sort of claim to belonging and conflating that claim to belonging with a claim to debt? You understand? And a claim to debt acknowledges these colonial places, and again, as Michael is teaching us and Bobby, places that may have claimed no colonialism, because Italy didn't really colonize either. Venice did, right? Milan did. It wasn't even Italy yet, so they tried to play this sort of game, okay? But what is now Italy is reaping the benefits, and they owe a debt, okay? And we need an us that acknowledges this in a global and concerted way and make them pay what they owe. Do you see? And so that is a different project though than saying, but of course I'm Italian. Well, but sure, but does it mean because you were born in a place and you speak a language? Because that for me is sort of, I don't want to ramble too much longer, but for me, I think that is a limited part of the project and doesn't actually think about the capacities through which we come to our knowledge and we come to our own embodiments, and we can get collectively to a kind of freedom that doesn't need these walls that are completely fabricated and white supremacist fortified to continue to exist. But I also, why I wanted Michael in particular, even though I'm not the facilitator, I'm just the Virgo, to have something to say, maybe not on this point, but I also, what we didn't get to talk about that I'm excited about is that us that I'm talking about in this sort of Black sense, coming from Sweden, Michael, I think there's also some connections that I've met from like, Afro-Scandinavian people, where Italians think of, Black Italians think of themselves as like, sort of like a minor colonialism. And this is Black people who've internalized this sort of story in terms of, well, people don't really talk about us, so they don't even know that, of course, I'm Black and I have my own culture, and this sort of, growing pains project of Black identification. And I know no one more knows this than someone in the Scandinavian context. So I wanted to sort of, I don't know, maybe leave it there, but Honor, if you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, thank you, Essay. Yes, if you wanted to add more, please, Michael and Bobby, and then we go for the conclusion. Please go ahead.
I'll leave this room to Michael.
Thank you. So yes, thank you, Essay. Thank you, Bobby. Let me just say something very, very brief, and this is something I have written a little about in a chapter called Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora in Europe. And that is that, the heterogeneous populations, African descendant populations of Europe, and the lack of joint ethnic, cultural, and even racial identities or identifications among African people of African descent across Europe is also in many ways, I think, a strength, and it points to the conditions of Pan-Africanism, the conditions globally, and also, you know, the need to maybe also question the identification with nationhood and nation states. And yes, so I think there's also some positive things to be said about this situation that essay pointed to, that Bobby also has pointed to, and that I pointed to, and that may actually also maybe rekindle Pan-Africanism and this sort of work towards social and global justice internationally even, or help rekindle this sort of work and spirit, if you will, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Like, we have a really perfect timing. It's like a minute before 7. that's great. Fatun, I don't know if you want to say something to conclude, but I just really want to thank all the speakers, Michael, Bobby, Essay, and Marie, who have to leave earlier, for joining for this conversation and for sharing your work and your thought. It was really inspiring. And yeah, I just really want to thank you for your contributions. Fatun, do you want to say something? I don't know. Or should we just wrap it up?
Thank you a lot. All of you. It was very inspiring for all of us. And yeah, we're waiting to meet you if you're in person as soon as possible, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just the train right away for me.
Thank you so much. And yeah, let's keep in touch and let's try to meet up in person at some point, I guess.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for
Thank you,
listening.
Michael.
Thank you for participating. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers,
Bobby.
Bye, Bobby.
Bye-bye. Bye, Michael.
Bye.
Bye, say bye.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.